conversations that are continuing into these spaces, and that's really fantastic. I do want to get us started on our program so that we make sure we have enough time for our plenary speaker today. But as you've probably come to expect, we have some announcements first. And since this is our last kind of large meal like this, I do want to take the opportunity one more time to say a few words of thanks. First of all, I want to ask those who are here at the meal who served on the local committee here in Raleigh to stand. Not here because they are still doing local committee things. But as you see those around who have name tags from Elon and from NC State, those who are in our Carolinas WPA affiliate, please make sure you tell them thank you. They've done just a terrific job of welcoming us here to Raleigh. And it's been a wonderful collaboration between different universities and different entities. A good example of what our affiliates can do, I think. I also want to say thank you to the many, many people here who served as reviewers for the conference this year. So if you served as a reviewer either for sessions or for our institutes, which was a new thing that we did this year, I'd like to ask you to stand so we can say thank you. And then I also want to say a very special word of thanks to Tracy Gardner. Could you stand, Tracy? This was a very last-minute decision that we made, Tracy and Jesse and I, in consultation. We wanted to try to do some live streaming, especially of the plenaries. She also live streamed the award ceremony last night. If you're following the Facebook feed, you got to see some of the comments too. And you know, we've had some hiccups here and there because we were doing this again kind of at the last minute, but we figured out a system that we think can work going forward for conferences in coming years as well. And I think this is a really wonderful tradition too. And travel funding sometimes is hard to come by depending on the location. We can't always go every year. I completely understand that. So it makes it possible to have access at least to the plenary sessions. And of course we publish them in the journal, but as you all know, especially from hearing our two plenaries so far, Rita's and Asao's plenaries, hearing it in person is different from reading it in a journal. And so I really appreciate the tremendous work that Tracy has done to live stream. And then finally, I wanted to remind those of you, the dedicated few who are going to be here tomorrow morning. I know you're going to be up bright and early for breakfast. We do have a town hall from 8 to 10 a.m. This is a tradition every year at WPA. It's a chance to participate in the life of the organization. I've heard a lot of you asking during the conference how you can get involved in the organization. This is a really, really good first step. What we're going to do at the town hall tomorrow morning is we'll have some breakout groups, some discussion groups, and we'll be talking about a couple of the things that have come up at the conference this year that I would like to see the agendas for us moving forward in the coming year. And I want us to have a really specific action plan for what we're going to do. And this is frankly, it's kind of selfish, but it's a good opportunity for me as the president to hear from all of you while you're here. So I really want to encourage you to be here tomorrow morning. We'll be having breakfast here, same place. We're not? Where are we?
Hanover 1 and 2.
Oh, thank you. Hanover 1 and 2. The staff is telling me to. No, don't bring them here. So we'll be in Hanover 1 and 2. So we usually have breakfast and the town hall in the same place. Is that the case? So come get some breakfast and we'll meet and talk about what we'll be doing for the coming year. At this point, I also want to turn your attention to next year's conference in Knoxville, Tennessee. So I'm going to ask Dominic Della Carpini, our Vice President, to come up, and Kirsten Benson from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, to talk about our next conference.
Thanks, Susan. I'm really honored to serve as the program chair for next year's conference. And you'll be getting information soon about the call for Institute proposals as well as proposals for the workshop. I really love what Susan has done in opening up the Institutes for proposals. We'll continue that next year. And frankly, you know, taking on this role at first I was a bit daunted, especially following Susan and Jesse and trying to do this the year after them with such a fine job they've done. But I'm feeling a whole lot better now. I took a site visit to Knoxville recently, and it's a wonderful, charming city. It will match the warmth in all ways, I think, of Raleigh. And I did fall in love with the downtown. It's a wonderful, wonderful place, and Kirsten will tell you a little bit more about that now. But look soon for the call for proposals, and I would love at the town hall as well to have your input on thoughts for next year's conference.
So thanks for giving us a few minutes to talk a little bit about Knoxville. And at your tables, you'll see a little bookmark, which I hope you'll all take home with you, just to remind you that the dates of next year's meeting. And I really hope that it'll be just as invigorating and inspiring as this one has been for me, and I know for all of you. So July 16 to 23, those are the dates for the workshop, institute, and conference. Knoxville is a really great place, as Dominic mentioned. The downtown area, the Hilton Hotel downtown is going to be the conference hotel. And it's right in the heart of the city. We're just steps away from all kinds of restaurants, and I hear that some people like to have a drink every now and then, and so there's plenty of bars right nearby as well. And one of the nice things I think is that you can sort of easily duck in and out of, say you're going to a session and you've done before and need a little break, and you can quickly duck outside and go to some place that's just really nearby. So I think you'll find it the easy walking distance to a lot of places to be just a nice thing. A few other highlights, let me just mention. The public library is nearby. There's lots of historical sites in Knoxville that are right in the downtown area, of literary figures like James Agee and Cormac McCarthy. There's Civil War history sites. There's an East Tennessee History Museum, all of which are just within blocks of the conference hotel. There's the 1982 World's Fair site, which is the Sun Sphere, which is on your bookmark there, and that comes from that site, and it's a nice place for kids if you have your kids with you. So it's again just right across the street from the conference. For those of you who love the outdoors and have time, maybe before or after the conference, Knoxville has a great urban wilderness with like 50 miles of trails, hiking trails and biking trails that are just about 2 miles from the downtown area. And a new zip line that I know some people have taken advantage of, not me though. But anyway, it's a really beautiful spot, and of course the Smoky Mountains also are just about 30 miles away from Knoxville. So there's a lot to offer, both in terms of the meeting itself and then also just outside of the conference. So I think that you'll find it really fun and interesting. In terms of getting there, I think 5-hour driving distance is most of North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, of course. So it's going to be easy, I think, to drive there for those of you who like to do that. And then Knoxville's airport is just about 20 minutes from downtown. All the major carriers, well, except for Southwest, which I know a lot of people like to take advantage of, that's in Nashville. Probably have some kind of option like a shuttle from Nashville if people want to do a Southwest, which I know is a lower cost carrier. But I think that you'll find that it's pretty easy to get to driving, flying, and even something like Megabus if you like to do that. I took that once, it was pretty fun. So anyway, we really look forward to seeing you there, and just hope that you enjoy the rest of today, and hope to see you next year there. So before I get to my announcements, there's one other person who I don't think we've
thanked sufficiently and who manages to avoid this because she's busy thanking everyone else. But Susan has put together an amazing program for us. I just surprised her with this. So now that I've surprised her, I will get on with my announcement. So as Susan just said, breakfast in the morning will not be in here. It'll be in the Hanover room. So when you're coming down the elevators, turn right instead of left. But tonight is the part that I really want to talk about. Actually, first, sorry, let me do one more round of thank yous first. Today's lunch was sponsored by Norton, and so I would like to thank them for sponsoring today's lunch. They've been very supportive, and I appreciate that. All of our sponsors have been great to work with, so thank you to all of you in the room. It's really greatly appreciate your support of the institution and the conference. So. This evening's social is sponsored by McGraw-Hill, so let me also take a moment to thank them for that sponsorship. We have a fun evening planned, regardless of the weather. We've got a band that will be setting up. They will begin performing at about 6:30, 6:45. Food will be ready before that. We've got Eastern versus Western style barbecue, and you will get to vote for your favorite. When you come into Jimmy B's, so down on the second floor lobby, go through the restaurant onto the Jimmy B's patio. They will be set up with for us with two styles of barbecue, Western style and Eastern style, North Carolina, with the traditional sides that go with those. You will get 2 tickets from me, red and blue. These are how you're going to vote for your favorite style of barbecue. The red will be for Western, the blue will be for Eastern. I promise there will be signs so you don't have to remember that. But you will keep half of this ticket because then from those votes we will draw for a door prize as well, so extra incentive to vote. So there'll be band, there'll be food, there'll be beer, also North Carolina beers. Should be a fun evening. There will also be some games on the patio, so plenty to keep us occupied and just enjoying and relaxing. I think that's it on my reminders for tonight. Please do come join us. Your combination of your name tag and your green ticket are your entry into tonight's event. I do have a few of spares still, so if you changed your mind about attending and would like to, just come catch me after lunch. But now, I'm pleased to introduce Tracy Morse to introduce our speaker.
How are you? Good. Barely awake, it looks like. Y'all are tired. I have the privilege to introduce our last plenary speaker. So at a conference themed engaging multiple perspectives in and about writing program administration, our president, Susan, has done an excellent job providing us with speakers to challenge our thinking and practices on what many may term difficult subjects. Yesterday, Sal challenged us to think critically about the inherent racism that exists within many of us and within our teaching and program practices. There are many parallels between inherent racism and inherent ableism, both within our work we do as writing teachers and as administrators. Today's speaker, Melanie Yergeau, will challenge us in her talk titled, Creating a Culture of Access in Writing Program Administration. Melanie is an assistant professor of English at the University of Michigan, going up for tenure. You may be reviewers. Her academic interests include digital media studies and disability studies, and more specifically, what the neurodiversity movement has to teach us about learning, writing, and being. Melanie is published in Kairos, Computers and Composition Online, Disability Studies Quarterly, and College English. In the 2013 Kairos project titled Multimodality in Motion, Disability in Kairotic Spaces, Melanie pushes us to think critically about accommodation and access. She writes about the forced invisibility and the exclusion of disabled people from the design of social and virtual spaces. She also reminds us that to accommodate is to retrofit, is to assume normative bodies as default and to build spaces and infrastructures around those normative default bodies. It is to deal with deviant bodily and spatial conditions as they bubble out at the seams. She argues it is through participatory design and self-advocacy that real change in our thinking and practices can be invoked. Melanie embodies this self-advocacy and disability rights mantra, nothing about us without us. For many years, Melanie has served on the board of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, a nonprofit organization run for and by autistic people, and she currently serves on the board of the National Autism Committee. Finally, I would not do this introduction justice if I did not mention Melanie's passion for the Electric Light Orchestra. You see, Melanie's an avid fan, obsessed really with ELO. The domain name of her personal site is Kiama, which is ELO's longest song. Over 11 minutes long. In doing my research for this introduction, I listened to Kiama, all 11 minutes long. And if I were as cool and badass as Melanie, I would provide you with an awesome ELO reference transition here. But I'll have to settle for. Please join me in welcoming.
Hello. I would sing an ELO song for you, but there are so many, and I know all the words to all of them. So maybe I can just, if anybody knows the song, Don't Bring Me Down. Most people think that they're singing Bruce in the chorus, but they're actually singing Groos, G-R-O-O-S, which is apparently German slang for hello or fantastic. So, not Bruce. Anyway. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm just really excited to talk with all of you. This has just been such a wonderful conference. I feel so privileged to have followed Asal and Rita, who gave plenaries earlier in the conference. Today, I'm going to be talking about creating a culture of access in writing program administration. And I'm going to get to the creating a culture of access toward the end, but I think in some ways I'm going to be really talking about structural ableism. And before I get going in that, I just wanted to attend to access and the room that we are in presently. So first of all, we're in tight quarters. Chairs are occupying almost every conceivable space. But if you want to take now as a moment to move around, or pretty much any moment throughout the talk, please feel free to do so. So be as you need to in this space. There's lots of room up here up front, and as long as you don't kick the tripod, you could even sit on the floor or lay down. I know, like, after eating lunch, that's like kind of what people want to do. I won't be offended. It's being live streamed, so you can go back later. Second, mentioning the live streaming, I wanted to thank Tracy for doing this. This is just so fantastic as an access measure. There are also scripts of the talk. So I printed 5 hard copies, and maybe I can hand them to Tracy if someone wants to look on with a hard copy, but it's also online. It's also online. The URL is posted at the top of this slide. I'm going to read it out loud. It's https://goo.gl/DP7I2V, and that last V is capitalized. When you get there, it's a Google Doc folder, and so you can follow along with the script, but the slides are up there as well. And if anybody is watching while this is live streaming, you can even look along while it's happening. There are also note cards on each table, and my hope is that we'll have a good 15 minutes or so to actually talk with each other. So if you have thoughts or questions and you want to jot them down on a note card, either for your own self-reference or if you even want to pass it up at the end, these are just another way of participating, and hopefully we can really generate conversation. So I think I've mentioned everything, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the image on this slide was taken at Eastern Michigan University. And it's the iconic wheelchair logo that you will often see in parking spaces or on bathroom signage. And somebody has defaced it, and I love it. They basically went around campus and then they put a bunch of these little white dot stickers over the faces and drew various facial expressions, and this one is very pissed off. So to return to the title here, creating a culture of access, I'm borrowing that phrase from Elizabeth Brewer, who is probably here in the room, so she can feel embarrassed. And it really borrows from her work, which is on mental disability and the design of campus spaces. A culture of access, she notes, is a culture of participation and redesign. Admittedly, I'm about to linger primarily on the problems of our field, on the ways in which the very design of writing studies works to promote ideologies of hyperability. But I'm going to linger on this badness, as it were, because in order to redesign our field, following Brewer, in order to foster a culture of access, we need first to recognize that disability is not the problem. Rather, we, a royal we, are. As I go through here, on some of the slides and as I'm talking, I'm going to give brief content descriptions just to sort of prepare you for some of the many badnesses that I'm talking about. So the first badness is non-experts who decide they are experts. I think we might all have some experience with this. So when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990, non-disabled people started panicking. Journalists claimed that the ADA offered a, quote, lifelong buffet of perks, not unlike outside, special breaks and procedural protections for people with, quote unquote, questionable disabilities. Politicians complained that the ADA was an invitation for an avalanche of frivolous lawsuits. Celebrities even joined the panic wagon at one point, and this probably comes as no surprise. Penn and Teller infamously claimed that the ADA coddled disabled people, because goodness knows that when we think about ramps and braille signage, we instantly think about coddling. Higher ed, of course, was not exempt from the ADA outcry. Faculty and administrators complained that so-called reasonable accommodations would only enable lazy students and fakers to game the system and lessen the rigor of a college education. And perhaps one of the more iconic stories of the ADA backlash is that of somnolent Samantha. In 1995, then Provost of Boston University, John Westling, severely restricted accommodations for learning disabled students. Among other moves, he forbade the Disability Services Office from approving accommodation requests and instead moved all authority to his office. And during the course of the school year, Westling delivered a series of talks that warned of the excesses of accommodation. As one example, he described somnolent Samantha, a student in one of his classes who, because of her supposed learning disability, required accommodations. And with disdain, Westling claimed that the letter explained that Samantha had a learning disability in the area of auditory processing, and he uses air quotes there, and would need the following accommodations: time and 1/2 on all quizzes, tests, and examinations, double time on any midterm or final examination, examinations in a room separate from other students, copies of my lecture notes, and a seat at the front of the class. Samantha, I was also informed, might fall asleep in my class, and I should be particularly concerned to fill her in on any material she missed while dozing. So, notably, Westling later revealed that the Samantha he's portraying here was a fiction. He completely made her up. And when several students with learning disabilities sued Boston University over disability discrimination, the court ruled in their favor in 1997 in large part because Westling Samantha stories expressed certain biases about learning disabled students. And after losing the lawsuit, Westling continued lambasting the ADA and disabled students, claiming, among other things, that somnolent Samantha symbolized real learning disabled students, that learning disabled students are victims of overblown and unscientific claims by disability advocates, and that universities have acceded to demands from extremists to exempt students from a growing range of academic requirements. And I felt that the image surrounding these John Westling quotes is particularly appropriate because it is a glass ornament that says caregivers are special angels. And I just imagine that being meant very sarcastically here. So it is now 2016, and yet I think that these remain very familiar arguments. John Westling is his own somnolent Samantha. So content, another bad myth, microaggressions. So shortly after a psychologist remarked that my IQ was too low for me to become a professor, I moved to Ohio and entered a PhD program. When I started this PhD program, I had no intention of becoming a disability activist, despite always having been disabled. And I dabbled in online forums. I even started a disability blog. I decided to ignore voicemail messages from disability services, and I spent a lot of time in Second Life. There's like an autistic island there. I haven't been there in a while, so these are old images from autistics.org. And one is a billboard that says Autistic Liberation Front. But I wasn't able, at that point in time, to really disclose or to come out. Instead, I was thinking questions like, am I a faker? Am I worthy of an education? As this next photo might suggest, given that there's a middle finger extended next to a wheelchair logo, my talk today will at times veer toward the angry. As someone who is multiply disabled and whose primary disability is often profiled as a condition that afflicts school shooters, this anger is born out of a frustration that has been building over the past decade, or more realistically, my entire life. And while I'm using personal narrative here as a means of arriving at larger points, I'm by no means trying to suggest that disability is individual or individualistic. Stephanie Kirschbaum, in particular, maintains that storying is an important move toward practices that are inclusive rather than exclusive of disability. And all too often, she describes, the stories we tell about disability are told from a non-disabled perspective, right? So that one student we had that one time way back when, or that really weird colleague. Usually there's a story about a copying machine. Right, or that technology that's killing everybody's brains, or those creepy people and those creepy conditions over there. To be clear, as far as disabled people go, I am relatively privileged. I graduated. I am afforded privileges based on my whiteness and based on my ascendancy from a childhood in poverty to the gainfully employed middle class, but also based on how others perceive my disability and my speech and my bodily comportment. There are times that I, quote unquote, pass or can pass as non-disabled, thanks to years of drill and repeat exercises and abusive therapies. And I mean that thanks sarcastically, as in thanks, Mom. So I'm hoping then that we might story together, that we might collectively and angrily survey a disciplinary landscape that is not only inaccessible or inhospitable to disabled people, but a landscape that actively hides disabled bodies from view and perpetrates exponential violences on those who are multiply marginalized. So we might even, for instance, come back to this very room with our very conference space in order to apprehend how the design of this space makes particular statements about the bodies it values, right? So the arrangement of tables and chairs, the lack of aisle space, the positioning and placement of screens and speakers. Whoever is like way in that back corner diagonally from me, howdy. Right, the line setup of our food stations, or the proximity of our exhibition tables to the walls, the unease or uneasiness or sheer mortal peril in which certain groups of people can or cannot access restrooms, the absence or presence of prepared materials and handouts during sessions, the unspoken belief that all participants are ready to engage in all modes at all times. And to be clear, in making these statements about this space, I am not laying blame at the feet of our amazing, truly, truly amazing conference organizers. Nor am I trying to claim that our space here right now is somehow more emblematic or more representative of ableism than other conference spaces. Rather, I'm making the claim that ableism is a structuring logic of rhetoric and composition, of higher education, of writing program administration, and we can keenly feel that ableism even in a mentorly welcoming space like CWPA. And as our previous keynote, I think especially, has made clear, there are people missing from this space, people who have been violently absented from this room. Inaccessibility is among the primary topoi of college discourse. So without inaccessibility, we would not be rigorous. Without inaccessibility, we would not have placement. Without inaccessibility, we would not have assessment. Without inaccessibility, we would not have literacy, which I think is something hugely, hugely important to think about. Without inaccessibility, would we even know ourselves as a discipline? So we are predicated on disability in order to do what we do. Another badness, but also somewhat a goodness, disability activism. So as Tracy mentioned a moment ago, nothing about us without us is really the rallying cry of the disability rights movement. And it's important as a motto because it very clearly makes known that representation is among one of the bigger problems when we think about disability, both from the perspective of how is disability portrayed, but also where are the disabled people. So I wasn't a we until graduate school. I had never knowingly met anyone with my disability until that point in time, despite the fact that 2% of the population supposedly shares my disability. And my experience isn't unique to myself, nor is it unique to my disability. Rarely do disabled people grow up around other disabled people. So clinicians frequently worry that putting multiple disabled people, especially children, together in a room might cause them to act more disabled. So these are the messages that are routinely inculcated in K through 12. Disability is a problemed currency. It's contagion and blight. And so, segregation, whether physical or conceptual, is part and parcel of the disability experience. As disabled people, we often have non-disabled families, are tracked into special education classes or residential schools, are forced into life skills curricula or sheltered workshops, are prevented from accessing spaces due to physical and social and sensorial and financial obstacles, are murdered by our caregivers and blamed for our own deaths because disability is just that bad on families. And according to university provosts and salon columnists alike, they have so much in common. I probably shouldn't say that. Our want of social change is merely a want of unearned handouts and perks. And I've been making a running list of the perks of being disabled. If anybody wants to add to it, I'd welcome it. So far includes such items as mercy killings, nursing homes, making 22 cents an hour at Goodwill, and experimental surgeries. So my focus here today isn't on the nuances and breakdowns of disability history or all of the items on this list. As I mentioned a moment ago, my focus is rather on this we of disability and the we of non-disability. And among other examples, I really want us to examine together how we, as WPAs, teachers, and colleagues, operationalize and reinforce ableism in the very design of our programs. And I don't want to end there. So how might we contest that ableism? Audience is a really treasured rhetorical concept. It's so treasured that when you're missing it, you have this special rhetorical triangle here with Band-Aids and blood. It's very treasured, right? It's a concept that often organizes how we talk about the work we do, not only as WPAs, but it organizes the curriculum we create for our programs, our students. But I remain unconvinced that audience as concept is meant to include the so-called cripples and the feeble-minded among its ranks. So I want us to consider, to really deeply consider, the ways in which we propagate a non-disabled default in our professional and pedagogical spaces. And I want us to consider, as many of our colleagues have claimed both at this conference and prior conferences about whiteness and heteronormativity, whether writing program administration and whether the very act of administering or teaching can ever be anything but ableist. So this, I realize, is kind of a long prelude. I'm good at that. It's the ELO song. But the systematic segregation of disabled people really, I don't think it can be emphasized enough. To quote Tanya Tichkovsky, who has a fantastic book called The Question of Access, disability is often represented as a reasonable exclusion. And her use of the word reasonable here is meant to invoke the reasonability clause of accommodations, but it's also a wry and sarcastic use of reasonable, right? She's making a belabored and despondent and annoyed invocation of the ways in which disabled people's absence from the body politic is all too often represented as a public and moral good. So disability is unreasonable, therefore it's reasonable to exclude disabled people. In WPA work, disabled people are reasonably excluded through multiple modes and means. We are reasonably excluded from first-year writing because we read with sound. We are reasonably excluded from health insurance plans because we are contingent. We are reasonably excluded from receiving job accommodations because being disabled and being older than 21 at the same time is impossible. We must be faking. We are reasonably excluded because interpreters and real-time captioning are too expensive. And imagine what the writing program could buy were it not for deaf scholars. We are reasonably excluded because we cannot afford a $5,000 diagnostic assessment for ADHD, and the university will not provide services without it. We are reasonably excluded because the beginning of the year program reception is hosted at the WPA's house, and it is more important to have a homey party than it is to consider the mobility and transportation needs of our graduate students and colleagues. I feel like I should have an image up here that says "fuck stairs." We are reasonably excluded because conference presenters do not distribute scripts or handouts of their talks, nor do they describe their slides and images. We are reasonably excluded because if a full-fledged faculty member cannot hear, process auditory information, or maintain tension, or walk long distances across conference sites and campuses, then she should not be a faculty member. We are reasonably excluded because the DSM isn't real. It's Tinkerbell. And this is an image of Tinkerbell with the DSM for a head. We are reasonably excluded because our course management and our e-portfolio systems are inaccessible. We are reasonably excluded because, as Amy Vidali suggests in her article in WPA, Disabling Writing Program Administration, if disability is only ever something bad that happens to WPAs and programs, there is scarce space for the disabled WPA to articulate her value and perspective. And for Vidali, she's talking about disabling writing program administration and using the word disable to really mean crip or even to fuck with. She's not meaning it in the sense of we need to eliminate disability. What we need to eliminate instead is ableism. So my next content warning, and I forgot to include a slide for it, so I'll just verbally say it, is haven't you overcome that yet? So upon arriving on campus as a new assistant professor, I began searching for information on how to request disability accommodations. To my surprise, there's nothing about this online. The Campus Disability Services Office only serves students. The hospital's Autism Center only serves individuals under the age of 25. The university HR website might as well be the seventh circle of hell. Photos of shiny, happy, presumably able people smile and riotously laugh in a cubicle. And I couldn't find the exact image from many years ago, but I imagine this one resembles it. So who the fuck smiles in an HR cubicle? Are the three of them so happy because they need a love contract? Where is the disability policy statement? Right? Disabled faculty and staff really seem not to exist. So in desperate need of disability support, I make several inquiries. I ask my new colleagues about who the disability services contact is for faculty, and one colleague tells me there's no such thing. I am eventually routed to the mother of a friend who used to TA at my university 15 years ago, who then routes me to administrative assistant, who then routes me to a singular name at HR, the university's ADA coordinator. We have one, whose office is located off campus in a lonely administrative building near the football stadium. Everybody loves to go there when you're at a big tech university. So I take 2 city buses to get there. And the ADA coordinator is really lovely, she's kind, she's very welcoming. She asks what I need. I describe the accommodations I received at my previous institution and she stops me. I don't grant requests, she explains, I mediate disputes over requests. So I need to contact my chair and/or direct supervisors, she tells me. I need to request accommodations from the body that, in part, determines whether or not I receive tenure. So, in her work on mental disability and writing studies, Margaret Price has often that mental disability is rhetorical disability. And in making this claim, Price isn't suggesting that disabled people are rhetorically impaired. Rather, she's following the work of people like Brenda Brueggemann, Catherine Prendergast, and Cindy Luecki-Wilson to suggest that we are all culturally primed to understand disability as a force that negates rhetoricity, communicability, and humanity. So the braining of discourse, she contends, wields particular violences on those who are disabled or neurodivergent. Disability chips away at something, and in higher ed, that something is teacher scholars' reason for being. If you are non-rhetorical, how can you succeed in a writing program, much less direct one? If others believe that you pathologically lack ethos, how will you ever be believed? So post-Newtown discourse on mental illness and mental disability writ large has added interminably soul-crushing layers to how faculty and administration have come to understand and treat disability in their students and colleagues. In the days after the shootings, I began collecting any news article I could find relating to mental disability. And within 3 days' time, I'd amassed 65 articles that in some way connected mental disabilities with planned violence, plus a half dozen that blamed school shootings on deinstitutionalization and the disability rights movement. Lock up the crazies, the article said. Sterilize the crazies, the article said. And most striking to me about the media coverage, though, were the assumptions made about audience, authorship, and competence. Right? And here is, I am holding a sign that says, I'm the crisis in your public health, except I've spelled your like a lolcat would. During the wake of this news coverage, we heard from parents and psychologists, neighbors and siblings, newsacres and politicians, teachers and administrators, all with theories to offer, all with suggestions for restructuring the mental health system, some with suggestions about how to read student poetry and other quote-unquote disturbing writing assignments. Find the warning signs. Students might write things that are predictive. Interpret a student's villanelle like it's Ulysses. Put your literature PhD to work. We did not hear from disabled people, though. Right? In all of this discourse, everything that gets represented about mental disability as being violent is done by non-disabled people. Some months later, staff from a dean's office visit our department meeting, and we discuss how to, quote unquote, handle students in crisis. One of the speakers relates a story about a former student who started hearing the voice of God. The faculty are supposed to be fearful of this anecdote, even as some in the room nervously laugh. What kind of writing does God inspire? Someone jokes after the meeting. Does the student hear the voice of capital G or lowercase g God? And so in that moment, memory transposes me. I don't grant requests, the ADA coordinator explains. I mediate disputes over requests. I need to contact my chair and/or direct supervisor, she tells me. I need to request accommodations from the body that, in part, determines whether or not I receive tenure. So through all of this, I wonder, do I really need an accommodation? Am I too crazy to be here? So this is where I'm going to close. When our field talks about access in the context of disability, we often talk about universal design, a concept that harbors particularly local histories given the work of Ron Mace and the Center for Universal Design at North Carolina State University. Universal design, or UD, is, in short, a design process that endeavors to include the maximum number of bodies possible. And UD's histories are architectural, and I've got a picture here of like a really pretty glass structure with lots of colors. But UD's current trajectories are interdisciplinary, and they've especially gained traction in educational spaces, so often you will hear people talk about universal design for learning, or UDL in particular, when they're invoking universal design. But what's important here is that there have been some notable and important critiques of universal design, many of them emerging from scholars in writing studies. And Jay Dolmage, in particular, has argued that universal design has become a way to talk about changing space to accommodate the broadest range of users, yet consistently overlooks the importance of continued feedback from these users. Importantly, Dolmage observes that pedagogically, universal design often functions as little more than a series of checklists, items that instructors and WPAs can simply check off and then contentedly ignore. And building upon Dolmage's work, I would also add that universal design does not, in the words of Amy Vidali, disable, crip, or dismantle WPA work. So universal design centers universality, and in doing so, it ironically decenters disability and disabled people. So it has become less a theory of design that works against ableism and more a theory of design that wants able-bodied people to also be happy. And what's more, as scholars like Sami Schock and Amy Hamre have made clear, universal design not only decenters, but flattens disabled people's experiences. It often assumes that all blind people, for example, experience blindness similarly, that disabled people are by default white, that a non-disabled person's assumption about disability constitute disability. And often in disability studies, you might see distinctions made between universal design and interdependent design, and that's something that Margaret Price and Amy Vidali have argued about in particular. But then there are also distinctions between universal design and participatory design. And it's that last one, participation, that I want to linger on, because it very directly invokes these questions about representation and who is making decisions and who is part of any given design process. And in this case, the wheelchair logo guy has a donut. So he was really involved. So Amy Vidali's call for interdependence in disabling writing program administration presents us with a timely challenge as well as a call for action. While there is no saccharine or easy mechanism for us to categorically undo ableism in one conference meeting, we should by no means feel exempted from or defeated by the work of disability ableism or fucking with writing program administration. Vidali's point, rather, is that disability disclosure is often interpreted as a welcoming of discrimination. that in admitting disability, our colleagues and students are forced to make themselves vulnerable, subject to institutional violences. So interdependence is coalitional work that disables the everyday and mundane work of writing program administration. And indeed, Vidali is not alone in making this claim. So Tanya Tchaikovsky, who I referenced earlier, but also Lydia Brown, who is a phenomenal blogger on disability rights, as well as Isaac West, have each independently advocated for coalitional activism around resonant social issues, noting in particular that both trans people and disabled people are routinely denied access to bathrooms and other spaces that are necessary preconditions for not only comfort, but safety, community, and life. As Tchaikovsky notes, the question of to pee or not to pee has become an ordering logic for how disabled people and queer people are forced to navigate the daily world, concerns that structure one's minute-to-minute life, concerns that non-disabled and cis-normative others might on some level understand, yet can never gutturally or emphatically know. And the example I want to end us with comes from Brenda Brueggemann, Jay Dolmich, and Cindy Luecki-Wilson's collection, Disability and the Teaching of Writing. And at the end of each chapter, they have examples of classroom exercises. And one exercise that they did in particular with their classes was to form human chains around all the inaccessible entrances of a campus building to force people to actually go in through the accessible entrances and to find the accessible and gender-neutral bathrooms, because the question of inconvenience, right, also is another ordering and structuring logic of ableism. So I'm going to stop here. I think we have 5 minutes, so I went a little bit over, but I'd love to hear from people. Questions or even note cards. If you have a note card, if you want to pass it down toward the front, or if anybody needs to do like a 30-second dance party, that's something Katie DeLuca, who's amazing, does with her students.
In some ways, does the literature, does your work talk about perhaps the need of redundancy in making spaces accessible? I think of the escalators being down here. I think of our building, if the elevator goes down. Now, of course, it's an old, terrible building, but the elevator has hardly ever gone down. But if it did, the building becomes totally, completely inaccessible.
Yeah, and the question and the comment was about redundancy in designs, and the example was the escalators not working, and so not having alternative options or multiple options for navigating a space. And that's a great question. It's something that's very much part and parcel of universal design, but also interdependent and participatory design. The idea that you need to have as many repetitions or iterations possible of accessing a particular space, because we can't assume stock ways of navigating terrain at all. Another example would be having scripts during a talk, right? So not defaulting to certain assumptions about modality and how people best access information or communicate would be another.
Nothing about us without us. And I was wondering about the sort of flip side of that, which is oftentimes talked about with regard to diversity where race is concerned in the classroom. Like we can, when we're reading the book by the Black author in our class, it's important not to turn to the one Black student in the class and be like, and what do Black people think about this? And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, where ableism is concerned, especially where representation is such an important issue.
So I'm going to try to sum it up with the microphone.
Sorry.
No, that's okay, and tell me if I'm totally botching what you just said. So the question has to do with representation in the classroom and not defaulting or putting on the spot or laying all of the burdens down on the one student in the classroom who happens to occupy the marginal identity that's being studied. So the example you gave is not deferring to the one student of color in the class or not deferring to the one disabled student. Yeah, and was there a question?
Well, so
Sorry.
yeah. And so, like, so if you have sort of suggestions about doing that either in the context of teaching or in the context of like design and program administration and leadership, to make sure that there are opportunities for representation that don't put an unfair burden of participation on people who are already multiply marginalized.
And I think that's a fantastic question. So like the question about not placing the undue burden or strategies for what instructors can do in those situations. I want to mention one really fantastic article, in part because I think it does this work on multiple fronts. It's a co-authored article. There are, I think, 6 different co-authors. And the lead authors, I think, are Jane Dunham, Sammy Schock, Leroy Moore, and Margaret Price. I think Hakimi Nishida, and I'm missing one co-author. But it's about building a Black disability studies pedagogy. And the reason I think that this is just such a phenomenal article is because it lays out sample units or curricula, but it also makes the case that like disability and race are not a shake and stir approach in a curriculum. Like you can't just have the one day in which you do all of the things, which then ultimately places burdens on specific students in those classes. I think also, at least in the case with disability, it often depends on what classes you teach and what spaces you make available for students to disclose in your classes. So Shannon Madden and Tara Wood have a fantastic piece in Kairos on creating disability accessibility statements in syllabi. And one of their main points there is it's not just a document that you should expect students to passively read, and it's not just a statement that needs to happen on the first day, but that kind of modeling of advocacy and welcoming of students who might access material differently needs to happen throughout the entire class. In particular, they not only give specific templates that you can use, but they also talk about like the negotiation of disclosure. And so when you're teaching something related to disability, often students who might not have identified as disabled at the start of a semester might suddenly come toward that identity. And it's a difficult space to negotiate it because classrooms are not safe spaces, and people come into these spaces with their own preconceived notions. But example.
Clancy Ratliff has put the URL to that article in the Facebook stream. So.
Awesome. So Tracy said that Clancy Ratliff has placed the URL to the article in the comment stream if you want to find it. So I think we might be out of time. So if you have note cards, I'd be happy to take them or stick around and talk, but thank you.